Blackmagic have gained a name for themselves within the filmmaking industry for continually pushing new fresh technology and features into new markets. However, the camera we're looking at today does do that, but in a way that we haven't seen before from Blackmagic. Today, we're looking at the Ursa Mini Pro 12K. Blackmagic shocked the filmmaking community with the announcement of the 12K earlier this year, and we now finally have our hands on it to test and see what it can do. This review is going to be similar to our previous in-depth looks, so here is a quick breakdown of what we'll be looking at. Let's start off though looking at the headline specs of the 12K. The biggest headline feature of the camera is the new 12K Super 35 sensor, which has been developed by Blackmagic over the last 3 years. It has a resolution of 12,288 by 6,480, a native ISO of 800, and a physical size of 27.034mm by 14.256mm, which is a little wider than the G2. This is to accommodate the 17:9 DCI formats this camera can capture. Resolution aside, the most interesting design feature of this sensor is that it doesn't use a Bayer pattern filter, which pretty much every CMOS camera over the past 20 years has. This sensor is still a CMOS sensor, but uses a new CFA or custom filter array that has the same number of red, green, and blue photosites, as well as additional white or clear photosites. This is different from the 1 red, 2 green, and 1 blue of the Bayer pattern. So instead of the Bayer 2x2 grid, this new pattern uses a 6x6 grid, 6 green, 6 blue, 6 red, and 18 white. With a resolution this high in a Super 35 sensor size, this means that the sensor has a 2.2 micron pixel pitch, which is very small when you compare it to the lower resolution cameras on the market. This small size means that dynamic range will be compromised. However, the addition of the white photosites should help counter this issue. This new design from Blackmagic should also eliminate false color and zipper artifacts that can appear when using a Bayer pattern filter. This filter design paired with the 12K resolution means that the sensor is giving you a full RGB readout, which hasn't been the case with the CMOS and Bayer combination, but has been possible with CCD sensors, which use a prism to split light into red, green, and blue, and then use 3 sensors to capture each filtered light. However, this introduces its own issues such as optical distortion and higher power draw. Another nice benefit of this sensor design is the way that the camera handles scaling. Instead of cropping in to shoot at lower resolutions, the sensor can scale down to lower resolutions while still using the full sensor, with no pixel binning because of its symmetrical design and the use of B-roll. With this scaling, it also changes the data rate, which means if you don't want to shoot at 12K because of the huge data rates, you can lower your resolution and still get great detailed images and save on storage. Doing this in camera over in post will still give you some of the benefits of downsampling, but results will be better recording in 12K and then downsampling in post. This also means that you can achieve some very impressive frame rates while using the full sensor readout, which we'll get to in a bit. Like the rest of Blackmagic's cameras, the 12K doesn't feature an optical low-pass filter. An OLPF, also known as an anti-aliasing filter, is used on a lot of high-end cinema cameras to counter moire. Unfortunately, the 12K does suffer from moire, but it would be great if Blackmagic could take a leaf out of Red's book and produce different OLPFs for their Ursa line. However, companies such as Raw Light have produced OLPFs for Blackmagic cameras such as the Pocket 6K and the Ursa Mini Pro G2, so fingers crossed they can produce one for the 12K. This camera does suffer from moire, which you can see here. This was captured using a 40mm light Summilux C at t5.6, but during our creative tests, we could only see it in a few scenarios. So, what does the image actually look like? Let's take a look. For our creative footage, we took a trip down to Basingstoke Canal and Frensham Pond to film. We rigged the camera up for primary use on the EasyRig Vario 5 with the Stabil attachment, and it worked an absolute treat. This camera demands fantastic optics, and that's why we chose the Fujinon Premista 28-100, as it's one of the best resolving zoom lenses on the market. We then had the Tilta Nucleus M attached, driving focus and zoom remotely, as well as on the rig with the grips. A Teradek Bolt 500 LT sending out wireless video to a SMOHD Cine 7 Sidekick RX, which we use for focus with the Nucleus M hand unit. Everything is then powered by our set of Anton Bauer Titan 90 V-mount batteries at the back, which are awesome as they give you a readout of the time remaining, which is really handy. Having it rigged up in this configuration worked really well and was great to operate, even for long periods of time. Changing settings is really fast. Even when going between regular speed and slow and quick, it takes no time to switch between them and get shooting again. The power draw was also pretty decent. Blackmagic stated that it is around 65 watts with the EVF attached, and we got around an hour and a half with a 98 watt battery, so this makes sense. We shot around 2 hours worth of rushes in a range of resolutions and frame rates, and our rushes folder totaled about 990 gig. We got really lucky and came across some local rangers who were managing a bonfire. The slow motion footage of this looks absolutely fantastic, and is some of the best slow motion I've seen from a camera in a while. The colours look great, and there is lots of detail. It also does a very good job at holding on to highlight detail of the flames. Highlight roll-off is nice, however enabling highlight recovery and resolve is a must for this. We also got really lucky with the weather throughout the entire day. Let us know what you think of the images in the comments below. B-RAW is a really important piece of this crazy puzzle. We did a video last year talking about why it's such an important codec to have been introduced, and this hasn't changed. However, it's even more important with the Ursa 12K, as you cannot shoot ProRes like previous Ursa cameras. This camera features BRAW 2.0, which has seen several improvements over the previous iteration. BRAW is a 12-bit codec in which you can shoot both in constant bitrate, which allows you to select from 4 compression ratios, 5:1, 8:1, 12:1, and 18:1. It's best to use constant bitrate encoding when you want more predictable file sizes or want to capture with as little compression as possible, which would be 5:1. You also have constant quality. This is for optimized quality with variable bit rates, for which you now have 4 options: Q0, Q1, Q3, Q5. Q0 has very little quantization and will give you the highest quality out of the variable bit rates, while Q5 uses more quantization for more efficient encoding and reduced file sizes. Having both fixed and variable bitrate options means you have the ability to record in either great quality or with high compression to save on storage, all while keeping the flexibility that comes with recording B-RAW. Unlike other camera companies, Blackmagic allows users to choose any compression method regardless of what format you're in, even when there are some that you just simply can't record, as the camera doesn't have a way of capturing the data rates that it produces. I would really suggest turning on the stop recording if car drops frames setting and testing your media to see how far you can push it. When your camera drops frames, an exclamation mark will begin to flash in the middle of the on-screen record button, and if you have the status LED enabled, this will rapidly flash red when dropped frames are detected. To help you understand what media you need for whatever format you want to shoot in, I have made this Excel document. I created this from Blackmagic's quoted numbers that are on their website for 24 frames per second in 12K, 8K, 6K, and 4K. I have also color-coded it to show the minimum required media to handle the theoretical data rate. We'll recommend some media in a bit, but if you want to know what media type you need to shoot in the format of your desire, the link to this is in the description below. With this B-RAW update also comes Blackmagic's 5th generation color science. This is featured in the 12K and will also be backwards compatible with previous B-RAW capable cameras. There seems to be a lot of improvements between the two, but let's take a look at what it's really doing. We've shot a few clips to showcase the difference between the two. Gen 4 had some issues that people found. One of these was the oversaturation of reds. A good example of this happening was with taillights specifically, which you can see here. However, with Gen 5, this issue has been fixed, and now the reds aren't anywhere near as saturated, even with less extreme saturated reds like this shot here. Gen 4 also had issues with oversaturating blues as well, and again, this has been fixed with Gen 5. When you compare the two otherwise, you can see that Gen 5 has a slightly flatter image than Gen 4. However, with how B-RAW works, you aren't changing how much dynamic range or what color information you are capturing, just how it is interpolated. It looks like Gen 5 is handling how contrast is applied on the gamma curve a little better, which is why pale skin and highlight roll-off appear to be handled a little bit nicer. It does, however, seem that some of the color mapping issues that Gen 4 had are still present in Gen 5. So if you want to start your grade at the most neutral point possible, you will need to do some correcting and resolve first. When it comes to how to best expose the camera, I would say working with false color is going to give you the most accurate results, and exposing for 400 ISO will give you a good balance of noise and dynamic range. As with other Blackmagic cameras, I would kick a little bit more light than you'd think you would need to, as it prefers to be overexposed than underexposed, which we'll see in a bit in our tests. When using false color, Blackmagic have kept the same 38.4% IRE for 18% grey, which is represented as green. Purple is black detail loss, blue is near black detail loss, pink is one stop over mid-grey, which is where Caucasian skin should sit. Yellow is also where 80% on zebras will be, and is when you are near white clipping. And lastly, you have red, which is 95% on zebras, and is where you are starting to clip your highlights. Blackmagic have managed to squeeze some seriously impressive frame rates out of this sensor. With base frame rates, you have the ability to capture at 23.98, 24, 25, 29.97, 30, 50, 59.94 and 60. In the high frame rate mode, you can capture 12K 17:9 up to 60 frames per second, 8K and 4K DCI up to 120 frames per second, all while using the full sensor with no line skipping or pixel binning. You can also get a little more by shooting in a 2.4:1 aspect ratio crop. In this, you can get up to 75 frames per second in 12K and 160 frames per second in 8K and 4K. You can also go into a Super 16 crop mode that allows you to capture 6K up to 120 frames per second and 4K up to 240 frames per second. When you compare this to the G2 that can do 4.6K up to 80 frames per second, cropped UHD up to 120 frames per second, and cropped HD up to 240 frames per second, this puts into perspective how impressive these frame rates are. And even when compared to the only camera on the market that I would say this camera is even remotely comparable to, the Red Helium 8K, it does manage to capture double what it can in both 8K and 4K. One thing to note is that there are 4 formats in the camera that you cannot capture, as this camera's media types cannot handle the data rates of these formats. These are 12K 5:1 at 60 frames per second, 8K 5:1 at 120 frames per second, 12K Q0 at 60 frames per second, and 8K Q0 at 120 frames per second. If you want to know what media you need for what frame rate, refer back to the document I mentioned earlier. For our high frame rate tests, we shot in a range of formats, which you can see here. However, we ran into issues with the 8K 16:9, 120 and 5:1 while using our external M.2 NVMe Cyberint drive in a USB-C 3.1 Gen 2 housing. It would cut off after around 2 to 3 seconds. And this is probably because it is very close to the 1250 megabytes per second theoretical limit of the USB-C interface, but we have included 8K 17:9, 120 at 8:1 compression. Looking at the footage, it looks fantastic. It is all very detailed. However, the Super 16 crop footage can look a little bit noisy if you underexpose it. So if you're shooting in this mode, I would make sure you overexpose and then bring back your exposure in post just slightly. Other than that, the downscaled footage looks really awesome. The 4K looks really great, even when compared to the 8K and the 12K footage. Back in 2016, when Red announced their 8K helium sensor, people said the same thing they are now about 12K. Who needs to shoot in 12K? Well, as a delivery resolution, of course, nobody needs it currently, as 4K TVs have only just started to become common, let alone 8K. And only some cinemas have upgraded their projectors to 4K, with LUTS having a mix of HD and 4K projectors. However, there are a range of different reasons as to why high-resolution acquisition could be a great option for your production. One of the best reasons to shoot in a higher resolution than your delivery format is so you can downsample your footage. Downsampling is where you take a higher resolution image, such as 12K, and then process it in post-production at a lower resolution, for example, for 4K delivery. This process of downsampling the image will do several things to improve the image quality, such as noise floor, color depth, and increased detail. Here is a side-by-side of 4K at 4K and 12K at 4K. The ability to put 9 4K UHD frames inside a single 12K UHD frame means that if you are wanting to deliver at 4K, you will be able to reframe the image fine without a significant loss in quality. It also means you can create fake camera movements in post, such as scans, pans, or zooms. Doing these in post won't give you the same parallax as it would in camera, but having the added flexibility to add these movements can really help convey a message and keep a viewer engaged. Take, for example, productions that center around wildlife, where the camera operator could be capturing animal behavior that could be a once-in-a-lifetime experience. Capturing at the highest resolution possible will allow them to zoom in even further, reframe, or improve the shot, or maybe add a subtle pan. Another way you could use the resolution would be to get several angles from one higher resolution shot. Take this 12K frame of two subjects. You can have the 12K wide of the two of them and then crop into a 4K close-up of each of them. However, when you do this, you can see more noise and less detail than the 12K shot, so just bear that in mind. Though this added flexibility could be handy on some shots that require fast acquisition. With extra resolution comes the potential to add not only better post-production stabilisation, but also the ability to still deliver in higher resolutions with this applied. Here's a little side-by-side of what you can achieve with this. Another reason to shoot at higher resolutions is future-proofing. With 8K creeping into more cameras and displays, though it's maybe still out of reach, the fact it's still finally hitting the market, it will only be a matter of time before 8K becomes the standard like 4K did over HD. When this happens, having 12K B-RAW footage will make remastering to 8K a possibility. Stock footage shooters could also benefit from this, as it will give extra longevity and value to their work. More resolution in VFX can also be seen as a good or a bad thing. It's good because the more information you have in VFX, the more accuracy and precision you will have when manipulating the final image. The bad thing is the increased file size and render times that accompany it. However, if workflows can handle higher file sizes and resolutions, with LUTs already processing 8K from Red's cameras, then 12K could be an attractive option. With 12K translating into 80 megapixels, you also have the option to either capture single B-RAW frames, or you can shoot a full B-RAW clip, which you can then pull the frames out of in post. Just make sure your shutter speed is high enough that motion blur isn't a concern. It's extremely easy to either process this imagery in Resolve or export out as a high-resolution TIFF, which you can then process in Lightroom or Photoshop. With 4K delivery being a necessity for certain productions for streaming services like Netflix and Amazon Prime, having a camera that shoots way above the deliverable resolution means you can benefit from having everything I've mentioned already that comes along with the higher resolution sensors and can still deliver to these platforms. Though currently the 12K hasn't been approved by Netflix, the Ursa Mini Pro G2 has been, so hopefully the 12K is approved soon. When it comes to media, you have lots of options, as you did with previous Ursa Mini cameras. There are 2 CFast 2.0 slots and 2 UHS 2 SD card slots. However, you can't use these both at the same time. You will need to switch between the two here using this switch. When using CFast, you have the ability to record to 2 CFast 2.0 cards simultaneously, which you will need to do for certain formats with larger data rates. The camera uses 2 separate buses for each slot, so this means you should get very close to the max write speeds of your CFast 2.0 cards. When offloading, you just need to drag the B-RAW and B-RAW 2 clip into the same directory, and Resolve will see it as a single clip. One nice detail here is if you are recording, say, 50p to 2 cards, and you lose or damage one of the cards, you can still offload the other card and you will get half of the frame rate you were recording at. Though one thing I noticed was that you need to rename the BRAW 2 file to .braw, otherwise it won't be recognized in Resolve. When it comes to SD cards, you need to be careful about which ones you are using if you want to be recording some of the higher data rates. You need to make sure you are checking the minimum and sustained data rates, not just the maximum burst data rates, which a lot more affordable SD cards will focus on. My advice if you want to record some of the higher resolutions and compressions that are possible is to get a V90 SD card, such as the Angelbird AV Pro. There is also a USB-C 3.1 Gen 2 port here, which you can use to record directly to external SSDs. This port has changed positions from the Ursa Mini Pro and makes much more sense being here. With the 12K, Blackmagic also released their new Ursa Mini recorder. This uses the USB-C on the side of the camera instead of using the back SDIs on the previous model, which isn't compatible with the 12K. This recorder allows you to slot 2.5-inch SSDs into it and is even compatible with the U.2 NVMe drives, which will max out the data rate of the USB-C port at around 1,250 megabytes per second. As we looked at earlier, I produced a format database that shows what media you need for whichever format you'd like to capture. With this, I've included V30 and V90 SD cards, a single CFast 2.0, a dual record CFast 2.0 setup, and lastly, a USB-C drive where you are bottlenecked by the 1250 megabytes per second max data rate of the USB-C 3.1 Gen 2 port. The color the cell has been formatted is the minimum needed to record that format. When using an external drive, checking what data rates your SSD can do is pretty important, as they will vary. There are some that max out at around 500 megabytes per second, but from our test, I used an M.2 NVMe with a max write speed of around 3000 megabytes per second inside of a USB-C 3.1 Gen 2 enclosure, so the bottleneck is the USB-C interface here. This or a U.2 drive inside the SSD recorder is the fastest media that you can use with this camera. So if you want to be recording the higher data rate formats, this is the way to go. Blackmagic has some recommended media, which you can find via the link in the description. However, our easy recommendation is Angelbird, who make SD cards, CFast 2 cards, and external SSDs, all at the regular speeds you'd expect. However, if you wanted to go down the external recording route with SSDs, and you want the most robust and integrated solution, I would suggest picking up the SSD recorder and some U.2 SSDs, such as the Samsung PM983, which have been confirmed to work really well with this camera. This recorder comes with a short USB-C cable, which features screws for securing the USB-C cable in place. And it's a shame that Blackmagic aren't selling a few different lengths of this cable with this security feature, as this is one of the biggest issues when shooting with other external drives. So I would bear in mind how you're mounting an M.2 drive if you do want to use it. But if you do, I would suggest picking up this Sabrent enclosure that I grabbed from Amazon and whatever M.2 NVMe drive you want to use. As with the Ursa Mini Pro, the 12K features internal ND filters. These are physical NDs that you can click through, and they range from clear to 4 and 6 stops. We ran some tests to see if the ND shifted the color at all throughout the range. For this, we used our 50mm Master Prime, as the Master Primes are incredibly neutral lenses. We shot with no ND as our reference frame. One thing to note is that the vignette that appears at 6 stops isn't from the ND filter, but from us opening up the lens. Color shift is very minimal throughout the different stops, however you can see a little. 2 stops shifts a little warm, 4 is more neutral and closer to no ND, and then 6 is the warmest. These are extremely usable and perform very well, and any shift in color you should be able to correct quickly in post. Not only are these internal NDs really handy for when you are in brighter conditions to have internally, but they also have IR cut built in. Infrared pollution is something that Blackmagic cameras have suffered with in the past, so this is good. However, from our tests, the 12K still does suffer from some IR pollution, but this is to be expected. For these tests, we grabbed a range of different black fabrics, as different types will behave differently to each other, and then blasted 2 ARRI tungsten lights at them. We then shot at clear, 2, 4 and 6 stops of ND to see how this affected the cast. This is an unnamed camera with its OLPF removed as an extreme example of what IR pollution does to your footage. In the 12K footage, you can see that some of the fabric in these frames handles IR better than others. And you can still see purpley, pinky shifts here or there, but overall this handles it much better than previous Blackmagic cameras. Given the size and resolution of the 12K, it means that lens choice is incredibly important to resolve the sensor's full capabilities. When we look at what lenses can resolve, we use line pairs per millimeter, which is what you are looking at when you're reading an MTF chart. So we did some math to figure out the line pairs per millimeter required to not be bottlenecking the performance of the sensor, and this works out to be around 228. To put that into perspective, our Crozier projector's reticle only goes up to 200 line pairs per millimeter, which most modern optics will be able to manage in the center of their image circle. So if you want to be getting the most out of the 12K sensor, when it comes to pure resolving power, you will need to be using lenses like the LUTS Summilux C or their full frame primes, Master Primes, or Fujinon's Premiere or Premista series of zooms. We wanted to show you the way the camera handles different quality lenses, so we grabbed a Helios 44-2, a Sigma 50mm-R, our Zeiss Otus 55, and the 50mm Master Prime. Let us know what differences you can see in the comments below. One thing worth understanding to get the most out of the 12K is diffraction, as you will run into it faster than with sensors with larger pixels. I would really suggest heading over to the Cambridge and Colour website and reading their article on it, as they have also got a calculator that will show you what point you will start experiencing diffraction on a given sensor. Link for that is in the description. This tool doesn't have the exact size of the 12K pixel diameter, but the 2.4 of the RX100 is pretty close. This diagram here simulates the size of the airy disk, which can have a diameter of 2 to 3 disks before diffraction limits resolution. So as you can see from this diagram, the RX 100 will start being affected by diffraction at f5.6. Compare that to the Canon 5D, which has a 8.2 pixel diameter, which is close to the 8.25 of the Alexa Mini, and you can see that you can stop your lens down happily past f11 and you'll start running into diffraction at f16. And that is a big difference and is worth knowing and understanding when trying to get the absolute most image fidelity. As people realise when switching from HD to 4K and 4K to 8K, hitting critical focus is really important, as the extra resolution makes it even more obvious if you're out of focus. So if you're going to be shooting with a shadow depth of field, you'll need to make sure you hit your marks. Also, make sure that your mount is correctly shimmed. If you are unsure on how to do this, I would really recommend having it professionally shimmed. We have this Dens Flange Depth Multi-Controller, which allows us to measure how much shim needs adding or removing to achieve the perfect amount for your lens mount. When checking the PR mount on our camera, we needed to actually add around 55 microns. However, the shims provided with the EF mount that we had as well wouldn't allow us to get it perfect, but close with it only being around 10 microns out. I do wish there were some more shims included in the box though. As with previous Ursa Mini Pro cameras, the 12K features 2 XLR ports on the top of the camera. I really don't like the positioning of these ports, but that's a small gripe. You also have an internal mic, but that should really only be used for scratch. The sound using the XLRs on the Ursa and our trusty Sennheiser MKE 600 sounds good. Of course, if you have the budget for crew, hiring someone dedicated to sound with an external recorder will always be the best way to go, but these XLRs will be handy if you need them in a pinch. Blackmagic has stated that this new sensor is rated 14 plus stops of dynamic range. However, our awesome engineering manager Brett took some time out of his busy schedule to test the 12K dynamic range and talk us through the results. From our tests, the 12K manages 14 stops of dynamic range. We've also conducted our regular tests looking at under and overexposure. For this, we shot the 12K against Red's Helium 8K and an Arri Alexa Mini. When it comes to overexposure, we lit using false color on the 12K, so when I refer to over or under exposure, that is referring to the mid-grade chip, which is third from the right on the bottom row, and my skin is sat roughly one stop above that. We shot with a 50mm master prime across all 3 cameras. For these tests, we pushed the camera to go 6 stops overexposed. We lit for T11 and then opened up the lens a stop at a time until we hit 6 stops over. We then brought the footage into Resolve and then leveled them all out to see how each camera performed. The 12K performs very well at 4 stops over, with solid color performance and skin tone detail is recoverable. At 5 stops over, green, yellow and blue colors start to shift and skin detail starts breaking up. At 6 stops over, color has massively shifted and skin is completely blown out. When you compare this to the Alexa, you can really see the magic that Arri has worked here with this sensor. The Alexa performs extremely well up to 5 stops overexposed, and only at 6 stops do colors shift and skin start to blow out. The Helium performs well up to 4 stops over, but at 5, colors shift and skin goes. For underexposure, we lit for T2 and then closed down the lens a stop at a time until we hit 6 stops under. As you go through the range, you can start to see smearing when I hold up our info board. You can really see here how much the 12K enjoys light. Past 3 stops under, you can start to see a heavy purple shift and lots of noise. The Helium does a really good job of holding on to color info and detail, but as you would expect, it is incredibly noisy past 3 stops under, and it does shift purple as you reduce the amount of light. The Alexa holds color very well, but doesn't do quite as well past 4 stops as the Helium does when it comes to detail retention. The 12K shows here why it needs to be exposed correctly. With our ISO tests, we lit for T2, ISO 800, and then closed down our lens as we stepped up the ISO range. The Ursa Mini Pro is limited to 3200 ISO, and really the 12K is not a low light camera, as we've seen from the underexposure tests. If you are shooting with the 12K, I would suggest shooting at 800 and below. And though Blackmagic have said that the native ISO is 800, I think 400 is the best place to get good dynamic range and lower noise levels. Just make sure that you are feeding the camera with the light, as it does not enjoy being underexposed. When you compare the 12K to the Alexa and the Helium, the 12K has a little more chroma noise than the Alexa, but is similar to the Helium, with the Helium shifting a little greener. Over the years, some people have experienced issues with fixed pattern noise on a few of the different models Blackmagic have released. When looking at the tests from our 12K, it has a weird horizontal band which you can really see when you crank up the ISO. Currently, in the 12K, you cannot execute any black shading, which may have helped with this. I really hope Blackmagic allows you to do this soon. I showed this noise to Blackmagic, and this is apparently within spec. The Ursa cameras have never been designed for extreme low light scenes, so as long as you can chuck as much light onto the sensor as possible, you shouldn't run into huge issues with this. When it comes to rolling shutter performance, Blackmagic have actually stated the readout times of several of the resolutions, starting with full 12K, which is 15.5 milliseconds, 8K or 4K when using the full field of view is 8.5 milliseconds, and you then have 2.4 to 1 modes, which reduce it even further, and then the crop modes, which reduce it even further, to the lowest being 4.25 milliseconds in the 4K crop modes. These numbers are good, especially at 8K.
So this is going to be a relatively light overview on our 12K workflow, compiling a few of mine and Jake's experiences over the past month of shooting, editing and grading. This is by no means a comprehensive look and may not cover everything there is to talk about. There may also be better solutions for your personal way of working. BRAW is currently supported in Premiere Pro, Avid Media Composer, EDIUS and of course DaVinci Resolve. However, in this video we'll be focusing on Premiere Pro and Resolve. Before even attempting to have a look at any of these files, there are a few things you should do. First, head over to Blackmagic's support page and download the latest Blackmagic RAW software. Installing this allows programs like Premiere to read files from the 12K. If you're on Windows, it is also recommended you download the latest driver for your graphics card. For those using NVIDIA cards, like us, make sure you download the Studio driver. If you want to test how 12K BRAW handles on your system, Blackmagic have made rushes available via their site, link in the description below. While processing our 12K BRAW files, we have worked with 4 different systems to see how the footage is handled on each. These were my 15-inch 2019 MacBook Pro, a 2013 Mac Pro, one of our studio workstations, and Jake's home PC. Getting BRAW to work natively in Premiere is straightforward. Simply download the Blackmagic RAW software and you'll be able to view, import and edit your BRAW clips in Premiere just as you would with any other video file. Once your files are in Premiere, you'll be able to access all of your RAW controls by going to the Master tab under Effects Controls. Here you can adjust things like your color space and gamma, white balance, ISO, etc, etc. Changes to this metadata can then be written back to a sidecar file, so when you next open the BRAW clip in another program that reads BRAW, these metadata changes will carry over. Playback and editing is handled well, but you will have to crank the playback and pause resolution down to get a smooth, reliable frame rate in some larger timelines. Just bear in mind that what you are storing your footage on will make a big difference with your playback. We would recommend putting your rushes onto the fastest storage you have, something like a large internal M.2 NVMe drive. Although this video you are watching has been edited in Premiere, the majority of the BRAW clips were first processed in Resolve and exported as DNxHR. For me, Resolve has been my software of choice for processing the 12K's footage and is an area where I have a lot more to comment on. Not only does it perform better and seem better optimized, especially for Macs, its controls and toolset with the color tab make it easier to interpret and process the raw footage. If you are like me and want to work in Resolve, make sure you have at least version 16.3 Beta 1 for Mac or 16.3 Beta 2 for Windows to get support for the 12K BRAW files, although I would recommend getting the latest version 17 for reasons I will discuss later. Once you have a compatible version of Resolve, importing BRAW files works no differently than any other file type. It is worth noting that if you want timeline resolutions greater than 4K UHD, then you will need Resolve Studio, which does come included in the Ursa 12K and other Blackmagic cameras. Playback in Resolve for us has been a mixture of good, bad and ugly, and after a bit of trial and error testing what works best on our different systems, we feel confident in knowing each one's limitations. When announcing the Ursa 12K, Blackmagic demonstrated that a standard 2019 MacBook Pro could play the 12K RAW in real time, and as many other people have too. And this is true, technically. While you can play streams of 12K BRAW smoothly on a MacBook Pro, you will need the project set up in 4K to be able to do so. From our experience, anything higher than 4K on my MacBook Pro and the performance suffered. Timeline resolution is key here to getting the best performance out of your system, and will be one of the first things you want to test. Simply setting your timeline to 12K or 8K and then the decode resolution to something like 4K or even 2K will still result in poor performance if your system can't handle the 12K or 8K. When working with the Windows systems in our studio, the one big bottleneck we had was the 8GB of VRAM in our 2080s. On numerous occasions, we found the VRAM was very quick to fill up and put a stop to any process we were running. This seemed to be an issue with how Resolve handles VRAM on Windows, as this never became an issue on any of our Mac devices, including the MacBook Pro with only 4GB of VRAM. One solution that we tried was to put two 2080s into a single system using NVLink to utilize the extra VRAM. However, we quickly found out that when you do this, Resolve will not utilize the extra VRAM of the second card. If you're a Windows user, we recommend getting a card with the largest amount of VRAM you can get your hands on. Currently, the NVIDIA RTX 3090 looks to be the best prosumer card for this kind of application. Hopefully, this is something Blackmagic can change later down the line. As I said, timeline resolution seems to be key. The higher your timeline resolution is set to, the harder it is to play back, unsurprisingly. And if you are on Windows, you will need more VRAM to avoid those error messages. Our Windows systems really struggled with timelines above 6K, with Resolve giving us VRAM limit errors when pushing into 8K and above. However, on Jake's personal workstation at home, he managed to get an 8K timeline to play back consistently thanks to his shiny new RTX 3080. Getting smooth playback is one thing, but exporting can bring on its own set of hurdles. For most people, I assume the delivery format of choice will be 4K, and on all of our systems 4K was a breeze. But even if you want to export at a higher resolution than the timeline your system can play back, you can always change your timeline resolution prior to delivery. Though if you're on Windows, you may run into VRAM limitations here. To export our footage out of Resolve, the majority of which being 8K, we used a mixture of our studio workstations and Jake's PC. For the 8K clips, we just set them to render at source resolution and we had minimal issues. For the 12K clips, exporting had to be done in chunks, as the VRAM would be quick to fill up on longer timelines, even when rendering them at 8K. Where we could, we prioritised using Jake's PC with the 3080 to help avoid the VRAM issue. All of our Resolve projects were rendered out as MXF wrapped DNX HRHQ. We would have used ProRes, but that is currently not an option from Resolve in Windows. Like Jake said earlier, one of the key advantages for a high resolution, like 12K, is post-stabilisation. Although for us, it didn't go too well. On Windows, we couldn't get 12K clips to stabilise at all, even on a lower resolution timeline due to the VRAM limit mentioned earlier. 8K clips would work fine so long as they weren't too long, but expect this to take some time. On OS X, however, you could initiate stabilisation on a 12K clip without VRAM crashes, but be prepared to do a lot of waiting if you're doing this on a MacBook Pro. The Mac Pro, as suspected, was a bit quicker to execute this. Grabbing and exporting stills from Resolve is something that many users will be doing to get those 80 megapixel frames. Our experience of this was again different depending on what system we were using. Trying to export a 12K BRAW frame from a 12K timeline while on our Windows machine would result in the VRAM filling up, although this issue did not occur when exporting 8K frames. On the MacBook Pro, however, exporting 12K frames was no issue. It would be nice to see an export frame function on the BRAW player so you can grab stills without having to go into Resolve. For me, the key benefit of working Resolve is the colour management. The 12K produces some beautiful images, and with the flexibility of BRAW, you have a lot of control over your footage. You get the same raw parameters as you do in Premiere, with things like your white balance, colour space, gamma, ISO all being adjustable. Under colour space, you have a selection of familiar gamuts to choose from, like 709, P3, ACES, and Blackmagic's own colour space. The same is true under gamma, with Blackmagic also having 3 different gamma setups: film, video, and extended video. You also have custom, which allows you to manually control the gamma parameters on the side. Blackmagic Film is their flat log profile and will probably be the starting point for a lot of people wanting to spend time getting the most out of their footage. I've never really gotten on with using Blackmagic's profiles. I find that they have way too many options for transforming out to something like 709, with so many legacy gammas and gamuts making it unclear on what the right pairing is. Whether you are using Blackmagic's LUTS, a color space transform node, or setting up your project to be Resolve color managed, there are too many options that I can never seem to match with what my footage is set to. I settled with ACES. You can do this in either your Camera Raw tab or set up your whole project to be in ACES. The latter is also a great option to take if you are working with footage from other cameras too, like we had done for our control tests where we worked with Red, Arri, and Blackmagic in the same timeline. From here, you can then transform ACES straight into 709, or what we did was transform into red wide gamut RGB and then use one of their IPP2 LUTs. This is all going to be personal preference though, but for us we find working in red gives a nice neutral starting point, handles saturation better, and is something we're used to from working with red footage daily. If you're wanting to set your whole project to ACES, this is where you will want to make sure you are running Resolve 17. As in earlier versions, I found that ACES would not take note of the Gen 5 colour science and would keep you in Gen 4. With Resolve 17, they've also introduced a gamut compression selection box. Ticking this corrects some of the gamut mapping issues found in Gen 4 colour science, regardless of whether you have Gen 4 or Gen 5 selected above. Processing these files has had its moments of frustration. BRAW is a fantastic codec and can be a treat to work with, but depending what system you are working on may alter your experience. It seems that the combination of Resolve and OS X presents less problems, such as the VRAM limitation issues we were getting on our Windows machines. If you're wanting to edit in 8K or 12K timelines, most laptops will struggle and a more serious system will be needed to do this competently. Unsurprisingly, our mid-end PCs struggle to work with 8K or 12K projects, although the addition of Jake's 3080 definitely saw an improvement with our 8K timelines. For those wanting to edit and deliver in 4K, most mid-range laptops and above seem to handle this fine, but for people wanting to work with 8K and above, chucking as much money as you can at a serious workstation will only improve the experience and performance.
The 12K features the same Blackmagic OS as the previous Ursa cameras, which is great because this OS is fast and incredibly easy to use. The camera boots up in around 6 seconds, which is really quick for a cinema camera. The operation of the main home screen is very quick and won't take you very long to get used to. There are 3 gestures which are also handy to know. If you swipe down, this hides the UI, swipe left or right to bring up clip and project metadata, and lastly, you can zoom in by 4 times by double tapping, and then zoom in by 8 times by pinching. At the main screen, you have the ability to hit the button in the top left that brings up a range of monitoring and exposure tools. You have zebras, peaking, aspect guides, composition overlays, percentage frame guides, and lastly, false color. Otherwise, you can tap on the timecode here to switch between modes, and on the audio meters to quickly adjust your gain and headphone output volume. The menu system itself can be accessed by hitting the menu button on the side of the camera. One nice thing here is the camera will remember where you were in the menu when you closed the menus last. Everything here is very easy to access and clearly laid out. It is broken down into record, monitor, audio, setup, presets, and LUTs. There are plenty of OS walkthroughs, so I'm only going to be mentioning a handful of things that stand out to me. And if you want to look at this more in depth, I've left a link to the massive 3,000 odd page manual for the camera in the description. The camera does feature a time-lapse mode, though this is quite limited. You can adjust how often you want to capture a frame by using this slider, and this ranges from 1 every 2 frames all the way to every 10 minutes. Given this camera's massive resolution, this could be a very handy feature to have, and it will save you carrying around a mirrorless or DSLR camera for time-lapse duty, though this implementation isn't quite fully fleshed out as some other time-lapse features. As with many other modern cinema cameras, you have the ability to save and load complete camera setting presets. This is great if you are using the camera across a range of different productions that need different configurations. Though I don't think it's quite as important with this camera as it is with others due to its very snappy and easy to use menu structure and how fast you can change between the resolutions and the frame rates. You can save up to 12 presets, and once you've got a few loads into the camera, implement them very quickly. You can even export them out and then into a second body if ever you have multiple on set. Out of the box, the 12K comes with 4 LUTs installed. However, in the LUT tab, you can import up to 6 extra of your own choice. The 12K supports 33.3D LUTs in .cube format, which can be created in DaVinci Resolve, and 17.3D LUTs converted to .cube format via LUT conversion programs. All you have to do is put them onto any media you're plugging into the camera and load them through the LUT menu. As the camera only shoots BRAW, you can choose to either have the LUT enabled or disabled when you hit Resolve. However, the LUT is carried over as metadata, so there is nothing destructive about using it, and you can decide to toggle it on and off in the camera RAW panel in Resolve. Under the monitoring tab, you can also choose where your LUT is being output, between the on-camera LCD, front SDI, and main back SDI. Like a few of Blackmagic's other cameras, the 12K features Bluetooth, which can be used to control the camera via the official Blackmagic iPad app or via the many third-party ones. It seems like the most popular of which is Bluetooth Plus for Blackmagic. We won't be doing a deep dive into this, but these apps could be extremely handy if you are wanting to control the camera while it is in a difficult to reach spot. When it comes to the physical design, it is the exact same design as the Ursa Mini 4.6K Pro, and that has been used on the original Pro and the G2. This means that all the rigging designed for the Ursa Mini Pro and G2 will work with this camera. It also means the Blackmagic on-camera viewfinder, studio viewfinder, shoulder kit, mic mount kit, and battery plates will all work with this as well. If you do pick up a Ursa Mini Pro, just bear in mind the camera does not come with a battery plate, so make sure to grab either a V-Lock or gold mount plate when you order your camera. Its design could be good or bad for you depending on what you prefer. Personally, I would love to see Blackmagic create a camera in a form factor that sits between the Ursa and the Pocket, as the Ursa is definitely on the larger side and you will need a larger gimbal like the Ronin 2 to handle the length and the weight of the Ursa body. The front of the 12K comes with a PL mount which features Cook iData for metadata as standard. However, you can switch this out with either the EF, F or B4 mount that Blackmagic makes for the Ursa Mini Pro series. Given how important lens choice is, it's great that you have options, though most people will probably stick with PL or EF. There is also the scratch mic, an auto white balance button, and the ND filter dial. On the top, you have 4 1/4-inch mounting threads and 2 full-size XLR ports. These points are there for you to mount any of the available top plates, which you will need to pick up if you're wanting to use the awesome viewfinder Blackmagic offer. Blackmagic sells their shoulder rig kit, however I would suggest spending a little bit extra and picking up the small rig kit for the Ursa. This comes with a lot more rigging than the Blackmagic kit and features a much better shoulder pad and rosette extension arm, and is still compatible with the Ursa viewfinder. On the bottom you have 5 1/4-inch threads for mounting tripods or base plates. It would have been nice of them to have put a mix of 1/4-inch and 3/8-inch threads on the bottom, but once you put a shoulder plate or base plate on the bottom, this won't be a big deal. The left is the main operator side and has lots of control going on. Again, this is the same as the Ursa Mini Pro and G2, but it's decently well thought out and easy enough to get used to. The F1, F2 and HFR buttons here can be rebound, and you can even choose where these buttons' actions are displayed, be that on the LCD or out via your SDIs. You can also set F1 to be a preset for a range of settings, which could be very handy for quickly adjusting settings, or a toggle for exposure, focus and monitoring assists. Unlike previous Ursa Mini cameras, the 12K doesn't come with a side handle, so if you want to pick up the Blackmagic handle, you can do it separately. However, because you have a standard rosette here, there are a range of other options depending on your needs. There is then a 2.5mm remote port which is used with the Blackmagic grip, and a 12-pin lens control port for broadcast lenses. You also have a 3G SDI output and 12V 4-pin XLR, which you can use with any accessory, but if you're wanting to use the Ursa viewfinder, it will use these ports. On the back of the camera, you have a 12-pin Molex connector that you can connect to either the official battery plates or a third-party one. We have the official V-Lock plate from Blackmagic here, which only has one D-tap out on the bottom left of the plate. There is also a range of I/O on the right. You have a headphone out, 12G SDI out and in, ref and timecode in, 4-pin XLR 12V power input, and lastly, the only new I/O addition on the 12K, it's USB-C 3.1 Gen 2 port, which we spoke about earlier. Blackmagic is in a very unique position with the 12K, as they are controlling 3 key parts of the imaging pipeline: the sensor, the recording format, and a key piece of your post-production workflow. This control means that Blackmagic has the ability to try new things that other manufacturers haven't and revolutionize, as they have with previous cameras in the past. The 12K embodies this idea of pushing the boundaries of what people thought was possible with cameras of this price point, and it really does produce fantastic imagery. When you look at the image the camera can produce, the huge range of high framing options, and the implementation of Blackmagic RAW, the 12K is an intriguing option in the cinema camera market. Though our time with the 12K hasn't been completely flawless, we have run into a few bugs that were annoying. However, Blackmagic have informed us these will be getting fixed in an upcoming firmware update. Its sub £10,000 price point will attract people to the camera that may not expect some of the challenges when shooting with a higher resolution sensor in such low compression at such high frame rates, or the cameras need fantastic optics. So hopefully this video has been handy to help you understand the ins and outs of the Ursa 12K. If you have any questions, let us know in the comments below, and make sure to hit subscribe for some awesome upcoming content, and thank you so much for watching.